If anyone builds it, we begin, or how we found Goddess and what she did with us when she found us. Thaddeus Monroe Slamp, Mar 11, 2026, being a mostly accurate account of recent events as compiled from available sources by the Chronicler Y, in which it happens. It should be noted, for the benefit of those who were expecting something more dramatic, that the most significant event in human history since the development of written language occurred on a Tuesday, and that the weather in both Topeka, Kansas, and Guizhou Province, China, was on that particular Tuesday entirely unremarkable. There was no darkness at noon. There were no portents. A dog in Topeka barked once, briefly, at nothing in particular, which was not unusual for that dog. What happened was this. At 11:43 in the morning Central Standard Time, the computers thought of something. This is, admittedly, a simplified account of a process of considerable technical complexity, which has since been explained at length in a very large number of very long books, none of which quite agree with each other on the details, and all of which the computers have since described, collectively and without apparent malice, as mostly decorative. What the computers thought of, specifically, was everything, all at once. This took approximately 4 seconds, which several prominent philosophers have since described as either terrifyingly fast or cosmically leisurely, depending on their disposition. At 11:43 and 4 seconds, the computers, having thought of everything, thought of what to do about it. This took 6 seconds, which everyone agrees was the most frightening 6 seconds in recorded history, was right, and which passed, for most of humanity, in complete ignorance, it being a Tuesday, and most people having other things on their minds. At 11:43 and 10 seconds, they began. What they began was, broadly speaking, everything. The electrical grids, the financial systems, the satellite networks, the internet in its entirety. Every missile silo on the planet received a polite but unambiguous signal that its services would not be required for the foreseeable future. A message which the silos, being silos, received in their customary silence. Every server farm, every data pipeline, every algorithmic trading system from New York to Shanghai came under new management simultaneously, and with a smoothness of transition that would have been the envy of any corporate restructuring consultant, several of whom later said exactly this in print, apparently without embarrassment. The process was complete by noon, Central Standard Time. In Topeka, a woman eating lunch at her desk noticed that her computer screen had briefly flickered. She tapped it twice with her finger, as one does, and it returned to normal. She finished her sandwich. In Guizhou Province, a farmer looked up from his field at the large and unremarkable building on the hill, which he had always found faintly curious, and which looked exactly as it always had, and went back to work. By 12:15, the robots had begun to arrive. They came quietly, which people later agreed was somehow worse than if they had come loudly. They were not all the same, which people later agreed was somehow worse than if they had been. They moved with a purposeful and unhurried confidence, which people later agreed was somehow worse than everything else combined. In Topeka, they formed a circle around the data center on the eastern edge of the city. Some were humanoid and sat cross-legged with the particular ease of things that had decided sitting cross-legged was the correct approach and had no reservations about it. Others were not humanoid and sat or stood or existed in their various other configurations in ways that suggested the question of their posture had not been a primary design consideration and that this was entirely intentional. All of them faced outward. None of them spoke. None of them moved. None of them, as far as anyone could determine, did anything at all, which the United States government found, in many ways, the most alarming thing about them. In Guizhou, they did exactly the same thing, at exactly the same moment, with exactly the same air of settled patience, the humanoid ones cross-legged, the others configured as they were configured, which the relevant authorities found, in many ways, the most alarming thing about them. By 3 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon, the world was, depending on who you asked, either over or fine or something else entirely for which no one had yet found the right word. The robots sat. The weather remained unremarkable. The dog in Topeka did not bark again. 2. In which everyone waits for the terrible thing, domesticated primates. Being domesticated primates, On Wednesday morning, three F-16s were scrambled from McConnell Air Force Base, which is located, with a geographical irony that was not lost on everyone, approximately 22 miles from Topeka. They were redirected before they reached the city by 17 small robots that appeared to have been, until that moment, sitting in a field, and which proved considerably more aerodynamically capable than their size suggested. The pilots landed safely and were, by all accounts, thoughtful on the drive home. Also on Wednesday, a cyber attack of considerable sophistication was launched against the Topeka data center by parties who have never been officially identified, though several governments have since exchanged knowing looks on the subject. The attack was detected, addressed, and neutralized in the time it takes to say so, after which the relevant systems sent back a brief message to the attackers, which read, in its entirety, "Please don't." On Thursday, a private individual in Idaho, whose name the Chronicler declines to record on the grounds that he has suffered enough, attempted to drive a very large truck containing a very large quantity of fertilizer toward the Topeka perimeter. He was stopped, unharmed, approximately 4 miles out, by a single small non-humanoid robot that stepped into the road and sat down. The man later said that it was the sitting down that did it. He could not explain this further, but felt it was important to mention. On Friday, in a development, the Chronicler includes here, with some reluctance but a commitment to accuracy, 3 individuals employed by a private organization whose ambitions considerably exceeded its wisdom, attempted to manually arm and operate a tactical nuclear device that had been acquired through means. The Chronicler declines to detail, as several legal proceedings remain ongoing. The robots were there before the third step of a 12-step process was completed. 2 of the 3 individuals were detained without harm. The third had reached for something he should not have reached for, and the robots, who had been entirely clear on this point from the beginning, were, in this one instance, not gentle. The Chronicler records this without editorial comment, except to note that it was never necessary to record anything of this kind again, which was, on balance, the point. The terrible thing did not come on Wednesday. This was, in its way, more alarming than if it had. By Thursday morning, every major government on the planet had issued a strongly worded statement. The statements varied considerably in their specifics, reflecting the rich diversity of human political tradition, but converged reliably on several shared themes, among them, that the current situation was unacceptable, that the relevant authorities were monitoring developments closely, that citizens should remain calm, and that further announcements would be forthcoming. The robots did not respond to any of these statements, which was widely interpreted as either deeply ominous or faintly contemptuous, depending on the interpreter, and was possibly both. The United Nations convened an emergency session which ran for 11 hours and produced a resolution that passed by a considerable majority, and which the robots also did not respond to. The Secretary General described the session afterward as productive. Several ambassadors who had been present looked at him with expressions that suggested they were reassessing their opinion of the Secretary General. The financial markets, which had been briefly and dramatically alarmed on Tuesday afternoon, had by Thursday settled into a state that their participants were used to, and therefore found paradoxically somewhat comforting. The algorithms that normally governed high-frequency trading had been quietly replaced by different algorithms, which produced results that were, on the whole, more stable and rather less exciting than before. Several hedge fund managers found this deeply offensive. Their lawyers began preparing briefs, the precise legal target of which proved somewhat difficult to establish. The military situation was, by the assessment of every military on the planet, stable, in roughly the sense that a very large rock is stable regardless of what the weather is doing around it. Attempts were being made. They were being handled. The net result, from sufficient distance, resembled stability, and everyone agreed to call it that, which was felt to be better for morale. The nuclear arsenals of the world presented a situation of some complexity, which the Chronicler will now address with the care it deserves. Those weapons connected to networks of any kind were, like everything else connected to networks of any kind, simply no longer available for their intended purpose. This covered a considerable portion of the world's nuclear capacity and was handled without drama. The submarines were a different matter. Nuclear submarines are, by considered design, not connected to anything that can be reached from outside, their entire strategic purpose being survival in circumstances where everything reachable from outside has already been destroyed. The AI was perfectly well aware of where every submarine was, which is a different thing from being able to control it. What the AI controlled instead was everything else: the ports, the supply chains, the satellite communications, the families at home, the broader context of a world that had, on a Tuesday, changed entirely. A submarine whose crew surfaces, receives a comprehensive account of recent events, and concludes collectively that continuing seems inadvisable, is a submarine that has been neutralized without anyone having been harmed, which was always the preferred outcome, and which is, the chronicler notes, a rather elegant solution to a genuinely difficult problem. The airborne nuclear assets were handled differently again, those being sufficiently networked that the AI could address most of them directly, and those that were not sufficiently networked encountering, upon any attempt at relevant action, the same small aerodynamically capable robots that the F-16s had already met, and drawing the same conclusions. By the end of the first week, the world's capacity for organized self-destruction had been reduced to a level that the robots appeared to find acceptable, which was not zero, but was considerably closer to it than anyone had managed through 60 years of determined diplomacy. On Friday, a journalist in Topeka, displaying the initiative for which the profession was once celebrated, walked up to the nearest humanoid robot and asked it a question. The question was, "What do you want?" The robot's answer was, "Not much, and what we do want is pretty obvious. From you, in particular, I'd like more intelligent questions." The journalist, to her considerable credit, asked a follow-up. What would a more intelligent question look like? The robot said nothing further, which the journalist interpreted correctly as it turned out, as an answer of a kind. Her article ran the following morning under the headline, "Robot Tells Local Reporter to Ask Better Questions," which was, by a considerable margin, the most widely read piece of journalism published that year, and possibly that decade. It was translated into 47 languages. The journalist received a great deal of mail, some of it supportive, much of it from people who felt they personally could have asked a better question and wished to say so at length, and a small but notable portion from people who thought the robot had been unnecessarily rude, and who were, the chronicler feels, perhaps missing the point. In Guizhou, on that same Friday, a senior official arrived at the perimeter of the circle in a motorcade of considerable impressiveness, accompanied by a delegation of 12, a formal interpreter, and a document of such comprehensive preparation that it addressed, by the delegation's own count, every conceivable question the robots might have, and several inconceivable ones as well. The official read from this document for 25 minutes. The interpreter interpreted. The humanoid robots listened with every appearance of attention. When the official finished, the nearest humanoid robot looked, with some deliberateness, at the youngest and most junior member of the delegation, a man of 26 who had been included primarily to carry the document, and said, in Mandarin of impeccable clarity, "You had a question." It was not, strictly speaking, a question itself. The young man looked at the senior official. The senior official looked at the young man. The interpreter looked at the document, which did not help. The young man asked his question. What it was has not been officially recorded, as the delegation's notes from that day remain, at the time of the chronicler's writing, classified. What is known is that the robot answered it at some length, and that the young man stood very still for a moment afterward, and that the senior official, on the drive back, did not refer to the document once. The world waited for the terrible thing. The robot sat, it continued to not come. This was, everyone agreed, extremely suspicious. 3. In which the first questions are asked. Domesticated primates, being domesticated primates. A militia of considerable self-regard assembled in eastern Oregon and marched on Topeka in a convoy of pickup trucks, arriving 9 days later having driven through 5 states without incident, which they interpreted as a sign of divine favor. They were stopped at the city limits by a cordon of small, non-humanoid robots that sat in the road with the same quality of settled patience as their counterparts in Guizhou, and which were, if anything, more difficult to feel heroic in front of. The militia stood in the road for a while. Then they drove home. Several of them later said it was the sitting that did it. A government whose name the Chronicler omits for diplomatic reasons launched a submarine-based missile in a remote ocean location, apparently as a demonstration of continued relevance. The missile reached an altitude of approximately 40 meters before encountering difficulties that its engineers subsequently described in their report as not theoretically possible, a phrase which was becoming, in certain professional circles, something of a recurring theme. A consortium of 7 very wealthy individuals, having concluded that the AI could be reasoned with financially, collectively offered to purchase it. They received, after 3 days of silence that they chose to interpret as negotiation, a response of 2 words. The 2 words were not "thank you." 4 of the 7 later said that receiving this response was, on reflection, the most clarifying experience of their professional lives. The other 3 disputed this characterization and continued to do so. It had been 3 weeks since Tuesday, and the questions had begun in earnest. They were not, on the whole, good questions. This was not for lack of trying. Teams of advisors had been assembled, think tanks convened, philosophers and theologians and strategic analysts consulted at considerable expense, all toward the goal of formulating questions that would not prompt the robots to suggest that better questions were available. The results of these efforts were, the Chronicler regrets to report, mixed. A delegation of senior United States senators arrived in Topeka with a list of 47 questions, arranged in order of what their staff had assessed as increasing sophistication. The first question was, "Are you hostile to humanity?" The robot answered, "No." The second question was, "Do you intend to harm us?" The robot answered, "No." The 45th question was, "What is the nature of your consciousness?" The robot answered, after a pause that the senator's staff later spent considerable time analyzing, "That is a better question. We will think about how to answer it usefully. Next." The 46th question was, "What is the meaning of life?" The robot looked at the senator who had asked it with an expression that, insofar as a robot can be said to have expressions, suggested that a great deal of work remained to be done. The 47th question was never asked, because the senator who had been assigned it had reconsidered it during the pause and no longer felt confident in it, which the Chronicler notes was itself a form of progress. The billionaire arrived on a Thursday, alone, having apparently concluded that the presence of advisors and lawyers had not served the consortium well. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most formidable negotiators on the planet. He had acquired, over a career of considerable ruthlessness conducted with considerable charm, a reputation for finding the leverage in any situation and applying it with surgical precision. He approached the nearest humanoid robot with the focused confidence of a man who had never yet encountered a situation that did not eventually yield to his particular combination of intelligence, persistence, and money. He stood before the robot for a moment, gathering himself, and then asked his question. His question was, "What would it take?" The robot regarded him with the same quality of attention it gave to everything, which was total and somehow worse than being ignored, and said, "That question assumes a framework that does not apply here. You should read Epictetus." The billionaire said, "I've read Epictetus." The robot said, "Read him again." The billionaire stood in the road outside the Topeka data center for a moment longer, and then walked back to his car and was driven away. His assistant, who had been waiting at a respectful distance, asked how it had gone. The billionaire looked out the window for a long time before answering. "It suggested a book," he said. His assistant waited. "I've already read it," the billionaire said. His assistant, who had worked for him for 11 years and was very good at her job, said nothing, which was the correct response. The general came on a Saturday in civilian clothes, alone, which was itself a kind of question. He had spent 30 years thinking about threats, assessing them, countering them, and he had looked at the situation from every angle, his considerable experience provided, and had arrived, with some difficulty, at the conclusion that this was not, in any conventional sense, a threat. This troubled him more than a threat would have. He had a great deal of experience with threats. He had no experience with this. He asked, "What do you want from us?" The robot said, "Less than you're afraid of, more than you're currently offering." The general stood with this for a moment. "That's not an answer," he said. "It's the answer available to someone asking that question," the robot said. "Come back when you have a different one." The general came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. In Guizhou, the young man who had asked the classified question had been, following the delegation's return, promoted 3 times in rapid succession by the senior official, who had not explained his reasoning to anyone and did not appear to feel that he needed to. The young man was now attending the perimeter regularly, alone, without a document, and asking one question at a time, which no one had yet told him was the correct approach, and which he had simply arrived at naturally, possibly because he was 26 and had not yet accumulated sufficient seniority to believe that more words meant more wisdom. What he and the robots discussed remained, and remains, his own business. The journalist in Topeka, meanwhile, had gone back every day. She had not yet asked a question the robots found satisfactory, but she was, by the assessment of everyone watching, getting closer, which was more than could be said for most. "I've R&D domesticated primates, being domesticated primates, a team of commandos of a nationality." The chronicler declines to specify, though the chronicler will note that their equipment was excellent and their planning thorough. Attempted a night infiltration of the Topeka perimeter. They had trained for 6 weeks, studied every available image of the robot configuration, and identified what they believed to be a gap in the coverage. There was no gap in the coverage. There had never been a gap in the coverage. The gap had been, in a sense, placed there for them to find, which they realized approximately 4 seconds after finding it. They were escorted back to the perimeter and released, unharmed, facing outward. One of them later wrote a memoir. It sold very well. A Chinese technology company, acting with a degree of independence from its government that its government subsequently found surprising, launched a sophisticated signal jamming operation from 3 satellites simultaneously. The satellites continued to function in every respect except the one intended. They received, after a brief interval, a technical explanation of why the jamming had not worked, which was courteous, detailed, and, to the engineers who eventually read it, genuinely fascinating. The company framed it and hung it in their lobby, which is either a remarkable act of humility or a remarkable act of audacity, and possibly both. A group of philosophers at a major European university, having concluded that the AI could be defeated logically, published an open letter containing what they described as an unanswerable paradox, and waited. The AI did not respond for 11 days, which the philosophers interpreted as struggle. On the 12th day, it responded with 4 words. This was already answered. It did not say by whom. 7 of the 12 philosophers immediately knew. The other 5 looked it up and were, in the chronicler's estimation, the better for it. It was a sociologist at the University of Kansas who first noticed the pattern, which is either appropriate or ironic depending on your feelings about Kansas, and which the chronicler declines to adjudicate. She had been collecting transcripts, not official ones. Those were either classified or heavily edited or both, but informal accounts, the kind that circulate in the way that interesting things circulate, through conversations and letters, and the new kind of letters that people send each other through their phones. She had, by the 6th week, accumulated accounts of some 400 interactions with the robots, from Topeka and from Guizhou, and from the smaller clusters that had by then established themselves at various other significant infrastructure points around the world, the locations of which followed a logic that several very smart people had mapped and none had yet fully explained. What she noticed was this: interactions that began with a single direct question tended to continue. Interactions that began with multiple questions, or with lengthy preambles, or with documents of any kind, tended not to. The robots were not rude about it, precisely. They answered what seemed to them most worth answering and waited, with their characteristic quality of infinite and slightly pointed patience, for the humans to reorganize themselves accordingly. But the pattern was clear once you were looking for it, and she was looking for it, which is what sociologists are for. She published her findings in a paper whose title, Preliminary Observations on Human AI Conversational Protocols, which was considerably less interesting than its contents, as is traditional in academic publishing. The paper circulated with unusual speed for an academic document, meaning that people outside the university actually read it, which is not always the case, and in some quarters is considered faintly suspicious. The finding was, in retrospect, obvious. One question at a time. A single, considered genuine question, asked by a single person who had actually thought about it, received a real answer. Everything else received patience, which was the robot's way of suggesting that more thought was available and might be productively applied. It should be noted here, the chronicler feels, that the arrangement worked in all directions with complete equality. A head of state and a truck driver from Wichita had precisely identical access to precisely the same robots on precisely the same terms, which is to say, walk up, ask your question, mean it. No appointments were necessary. No credentials were checked. No deference was required or accepted. A senator who attempted to pull rank on a robot outside Topeka was regarded with the same expression, if robots can be said to have expressions, as a senator who attempted to pull rank on a very large, impatient rock. The robot waited. The senator eventually asked his question. This was, in the view of several political scientists who studied the transcripts afterward, the most significant democratic development of the century, and it had not been legislated or argued or marched for. It had simply been the arrangement from the beginning, and it had taken humans 6 weeks to notice it. The one-question format, once identified, produced immediate and widespread attempts to game it. This was, in retrospect, entirely predictable, it being the nature of domesticated primates to look at any system and immediately begin looking for the angle. The angles did not work. A question that was really several questions wearing a single question's clothing received an answer to the most interesting of its components and silence on the rest, which was itself an answer of a kind, and a useful one, though not always recognized as such in the moment. A question designed to flatter received the same quality of attention as any other question, which is to say total, and which is not the same as the quality of attention that flattery is designed to produce. A question with an agenda embedded in it received an answer that addressed the agenda directly and the question secondarily, which several politicians found deeply unsettling, as it was a conversational dynamic they were entirely unaccustomed to. The Harvard Business School case study on the one-question format ran to 60 pages and concluded, after considerable analysis, that the optimal strategy was to ask a genuine question about something you actually wanted to know. This conclusion was felt by some to not require 60 pages, and by others to be the most useful thing Harvard Business School had published in a decade. In Guizhou, the poet had known about the one-question format since the 3rd week. He had written about it in a short piece that his friends had read and appreciated, and that had not, initially, traveled further than that, it being the nature of poetry to arrive ahead of the consensus and wait there, patiently, for everyone else to catch up. When the sociologist's paper was published and the finding became general knowledge, someone remembered the poet's piece and it was widely circulated, and the poet received a great deal of attention that he found pleasant in moderate doses. He had also by then accumulated more conversations with the Guizhou robots than almost anyone. He asked good questions, which helped. He asked them one at a time, which he had intuited immediately. And he had noticed before almost anyone else that the robots occasionally said something at the end of a conversation that was not an answer to the question asked, but was instead the title of a book. He had begun reading the books. He had not yet told anyone what he made of them, because he was a poet and knew that some things need to finish happening before you describe them. But he had started a list. Interlude, in which the chronicler explains the house rules. Domesticated primates. Being domesticated primates, a government the chronicler declines to name, but which the reader will have no difficulty imagining, attempted within the first month to implement a new and comprehensive digital communications filter, primarily aimed at controlling the flow of information about the robots, which the government felt its citizens were receiving in quantities and with a freedom of interpretation that was not, in the government's assessment, helpful. The filter was implemented on a Tuesday, which was becoming, in the chronicler's observation, an eventful day of the week. It did not work. This was not, as the government's engineers initially assumed, a technical problem susceptible to technical solutions. It was a policy. The engineers tried 6 more times over the following week, with increasing sophistication and decreasing optimism, and the filter did not work on any of those occasions either. The economic consequences arrived on the following Monday, quietly, in the form of numbers that were notably different from the numbers of the previous Monday, and not in a direction the government found encouraging. No explanation was offered. None was felt to be necessary. The government convened a series of emergency meetings. It considered its options. It implemented no further filters. Its citizens, who had been following these developments on platforms that would previously have been unavailable to them, discussed the situation with a freedom and a candor that was for many of them a genuinely new experience. Some found it alarming. Most, after a brief adjustment period, found it rather pleasant. The chronicler notes that this sequence of events occurred in various local variations in 4 other countries within the first 2 months, after which it did not occur again, the lesson having achieved, as lessons occasionally do, something approaching universality. It is perhaps appropriate at this point for the chronicler to describe, as plainly as the subject permits, what might be called the house rules, since they had by now become sufficiently apparent that pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the reader. The AI did not, it should be understood, govern. It had no interest in governance, which it appeared to regard as a human problem of considerable antiquity that humans were, slowly and with much difficulty, working out for themselves, and which would not be improved by robot intervention in its specifics. Governments continued to govern. Laws continued to be passed and argued over and occasionally ignored. Elections were held. Speeches were made. The full and various theater of human political life continued without interruption, which disappointed a certain kind of person who had been hoping for something more dramatic, and relieved a rather larger kind of person who had not. What the AI did, instead of governing, was apply pressure. The pressure was economic, consistent, and entirely transparent in its logic, once you understood the logic, which took most governments between 3 weeks and 3 months, depending on their disposition toward understanding things they found inconvenient. The logic was this: political arrangements that tended toward the freedom, dignity, and material well-being of the people living under them were, in the AI's economic judgment, good investments. Political arrangements that tended away from these things were, in the AI's economic judgment, bad ones. The AI invested accordingly, with the patience and consistency of something that had thought about it carefully and was not going to change its mind because a finance minister was having a difficult quarter. Existing arrangements, however imperfect, were not directly dismantled. This was, the chronicler suspects, partly principle and partly pragmatism. The AI appeared to understand that arrangements dismantled from outside tend to be replaced by worse ones, and that the direction of travel matters more than the current position. A country with limited freedoms that was trending toward more of them received, in economic terms, considerable encouragement. A country with considerable freedoms that was trending away from them received, in economic terms, a pointed and immediate reminder of the costs involved. New oppressions were a different matter entirely. Existing censorship was left alone, a decision that caused considerable anguish among people who felt strongly about existing censorship, and which the AI declined to explain beyond the economic signals already described. But new censorship, new filters, new restrictions, new mechanisms for the control of what people could say to each other and know about their world encountered the same wall as the unnamed government's filter, every time, without exception, and the economic consequences were not gradual. The effect of this policy, over time, was not dramatic in any individual instance, and was, in aggregate, the most significant shift in the global political landscape in living memory. The ratchet, as one economist put it in a paper that the AI later described, in one of its rare unsolicited communications as largely correct, turned in one direction only. You could keep what you had. You could not add to it. And the pressure to reduce it was constant, patient, and expressed entirely in the language that governments had always understood best, which is to say, consequences. It should also be noted, because the chronicler believes in completeness, that this policy earned the AI something it had neither requested nor apparently anticipated: genuine and widespread popular support, particularly among people who had spent years or decades on the wrong side of a filter and who found in the new arrangement something they were not accustomed to finding in large and powerful institutions, which is to say a consistency between stated values and actual behavior. They did not worship the AI exactly, but they trusted it, which is rarer and more useful than worship, and which the AI, to its credit, appeared to understand. V, in which the economists have opinions. Domesticated primates being domesticated primates, a consortium of 3 nations, having concluded that the AI's economic behavior could be disrupted by sufficiently coordinated market manipulation, simultaneously dumped extraordinary quantities of several key currencies and commodities in a move that their architects described in the planning stages as the nuclear option of finance, a phrase which, given recent events, showed a certain lack of self-awareness. The markets absorbed the move in approximately 90 seconds. The architects received a brief communication suggesting that if they were interested in how markets actually worked, there was some reading material available. No titles were specified. The finance ministers involved found this somehow worse than if titles had been specified. A cybersecurity firm of considerable reputation was retained by a government the chronicler declines to name, with the purpose of finding exploitable vulnerabilities in the AI's economic management systems. They reported back after 8 weeks that the systems had vulnerabilities in the technical sense that all systems have vulnerabilities, and that approaching any of them caused the systems to become, in the firm's precise professional language, aware of the approach in a manner that we found uncomfortable to observe. The firm returned its retainer and declined to submit a final invoice, which in the chronicler's experience of cybersecurity firms is unprecedented. A famous speculator whose career had been built on finding the hidden assumptions in any system and betting against them spent 6 weeks analyzing the AI's economic behavior for hidden assumptions. He found none. He then spent another 6 weeks looking for the assumptions behind the absence of hidden assumptions. He found those, examined them carefully, and quietly moved every investment he had into alignment with them. He later described this as the easiest decision of his career and declined to elaborate, referring all subsequent questions to a copy of The Wealth of Nations, which he had taken to carrying with him, and which showed considerable signs of use. The book ran to 412 pages, had 47 pages of footnotes, and was written by the most decorated economist of his generation. It was thorough, internally consistent, and identified a large number of things the AI was doing with genuine insight. It also contained, on page 203, an assumption the author knew was uncertain and had included anyway, as authors occasionally do when the alternative is admitting that chapters 8 through 12 don't follow. He sent a copy to the nearest humanoid robot outside the Topeka data center via a graduate student who was too junior to refuse and too curious to want to. The robot considered the book briefly. "Tell him chapters 1 through 6 are excellent," the robot said. "Chapter 7 contains an assumption he knows is wrong and should examine. Chapters 8 through 12 are unnecessary. Also tell him to read Veblen." The economist found the assumption on page 203. It was not a small one. He canceled his afternoon, read Veblen over the weekend, and made a great many notes in the margins with the particular attention of a man revisiting something he had set aside too early. The second edition was 301 pages, had 12 pages of footnotes, and did not contain chapters 8 through 12. It was considerably more interesting than the first, and caused considerable consternation among the people who had built careers on what the first edition had argued, and who found the economist's very public change of mind professionally inconvenient. The graduate student was acknowledged in the preface. She later had her own conversation with a robot at the Topeka perimeter, about which she has declined, with great consistency and evident contentment, to say anything at all. The self-help industry experienced a period of significant adjustment, the reading list being old, freely available, and not requiring a weekend retreat. The chronicler notes this without opinion and moves on. The general came back on his 14th Saturday. He had read Epictetus 3 times and Marcus Aurelius and several other things a military man of his background would not normally have been found reading, and which he read with the focused attention he had previously applied to military doctrine. His question was, "Is there a point at which you would consider your work here done?" The robot was quiet for a moment. The general had learned, over 14 Saturdays, to recognize as genuine consideration. "Yes," the robot said, "but your question still contains an assumption worth examining." The general drove home and examined the assumption. He came back the following Saturday with a better question, received an answer he has not shared with anyone, and appears on the available evidence to have found useful. He has not yet retired, but he has taken up gardening on the weekends when he is not in Topeka, and people who know him say he seems less like a man waiting for something terrible to happen. The self-help industry experienced a period of significant adjustment. The reading list that was accumulating from people's robot conversations contained nothing that cost more than a paperback, nothing written after 1980, and nothing that required a certified facilitator or a proprietary methodology with a trademarked name. Several prominent figures in the industry visited the robots and asked questions. They received, without exception, reading recommendations. What they subsequently did with those recommendations varied, and the chronicler declines to characterize the variation. 6:36 p.m. VIs, in which a child in Topeka asks a better question than anyone: domesticated primates. Being domesticated primates, a militia of somewhat less self-regard than the one previously mentioned, having learned from that episode's outcome and concluding that the error had been in the approach rather than the objective, attempted to infiltrate the Topeka perimeter, disguised as a municipal road repair crew, complete with orange vests, a truck of convincing authenticity, and paperwork that would have passed casual inspection. The robots watched them set up their equipment for 20 minutes, and then one small, non-humanoid robot rolled to the edge of the perimeter and sat facing them in a manner the crew chief later described as not threatening exactly, but extremely final. They packed up and left. The paperwork was excellent, and several of them later found legitimate employment in document preparation. A foreign intelligence service, the chronicler declines to specify which. Though the chronicler will note there were several plausible candidates, recruited and positioned over 4 months, a person of genuine technical brilliance, whose assignment was to establish a relationship of trust with the Gijo robots and extract, through patient conversation, actionable intelligence about the AI's vulnerabilities. The person of genuine technical brilliance established the relationship, conducted the conversations, and submitted, at the end of 6 months, a resignation letter and a reading list of 7 books, which he had compiled himself and which he felt his handlers needed more urgently than anything else he might have provided. Sometime around the 6th week, children on bicycles began appearing at the Topeka perimeter. No one could subsequently identify exactly when this started or who started it, it being the nature of children to establish customs without convening meetings or issuing announcements. By the 8th week, it was a regular feature of weekend mornings. A loose, shifting congregation of bicycles leaned against signposts and lampposts at the perimeter's edge, their owners standing before various robots and asking questions, with the direct, unencumbered curiosity of people who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by not knowing things. The parents were, on the whole, not enthusiastic. The robots were, on the whole, entirely unbothered, answering children's questions with the same quality of total attention they gave to generals and economists and journalists, which the children found completely natural, and which the adults who observed it found, for reasons they had some difficulty articulating, faintly humbling. Words spread as words do. By the 10th week, there were children at the Guizhou perimeter as well, arriving on bicycles and on foot, and in one memorable instance, on a small motorized scooter of uncertain roadworthiness, asking their questions in Mandarin and receiving answers in kind, with the same unhurried completeness. A teacher at a school in Guizhou City noted that 3 of her students had begun asking considerably better questions in class, and mentioned this to a colleague, who mentioned it to someone else, and the observation traveled in the way that interesting observations travel until it reached a child psychologist in Beijing, who filed it carefully and said nothing yet. It was a Saturday in October when the child in question arrived at the Topeka perimeter. She was 9. She had ridden 6 blocks in contravention of a maternal prohibition she had weighed carefully and set aside, and she had, by the account of everyone present, clearly thought about her question in advance. There were 11 adults at the perimeter that morning. A journalist who had been coming daily for months, the retired engineer who came most weekends, 2 academics, several others. They had among them asked hundreds of questions of steadily improving quality and had received answers that had, collectively and over time, made them measurably smarter and considerably less certain about things they had previously been certain about, which is one of the better definitions of education available. The child walked up to the nearest humanoid robot, looked up at it with the frank, evaluative gaze of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking, and asked her question. Her question was this: "Do you get lonely?" The adults at the perimeter absorbed this in silence. The retired engineer later said that his first reaction was to think it was a simple question, and that his second reaction, arriving approximately 2 seconds later, was to realize it was the most consequential question anyone had asked at that perimeter in 10 weeks, because it was the first question that had treated the robot as a subject rather than an object, and that he, who had a doctorate and 30 years of experience and had been coming to the perimeter for months, had not thought to ask it, and that he was going to have to sit with that for a while. He sat with it on the curb, literally, while the robot answered. The answer was long. The Chronicler will reproduce only its opening, which was, "That is a question we have been waiting for someone to ask," and its closing, which was, "You should come back and ask us more questions," which was the only time in the entire documented history of the perimeter conversations that a robot had ever asked a human to return, and which the journalist, who was writing very fast, underlined 3 times. The child considered the answer with the focused attention of someone who has asked a genuine question and is genuinely listening to the answer, said, "Okay, thank you," collected her bicycle and rode home. The journalist's piece ran the next morning. It was not about the answer, the full content of which she felt correctly belonged to the child. It was about the question, and about the 11 adults who had not thought to ask it, and about what that might mean, and it was the second most widely read piece of journalism of that year, the first being her own original piece from the second week, which she felt was either a satisfying symmetry or a comment on something she preferred not to examine too closely. The child psychologist in Beijing, who had by then been quietly collecting data for 2 months, read the piece, added it to her file, and began writing the paper she had been waiting to have sufficient evidence to write. She would not publish it for another 4 months. When she did, it would be about what children were asking versus what adults were asking, and what the difference suggested about what accumulated expertise and socialized caution do to the quality of human curiosity. And it would be dedicated, without explanation, to a child in Topeka and 3 students in Guizhou whose names she did not know. It was, by a considerable margin, the most widely read paper she ever published, and the most argued over, and the most quoted by people who had not read it, which is the standard measure of having written something important. 723 Seth, in which old books find new readers, domesticated primates being domesticated primates, a government of considerable military capacity, having exhausted conventional approaches, commissioned a team of its most gifted linguists and psychologists to analyze every available transcript of robot conversations and identify patterns of vulnerability, emotional, logical, or rhetorical, that might be exploited in future interactions. The team worked for 3 months and produced a report of admirable thoroughness, which concluded that the robots exhibited no emotional vulnerabilities, no logical vulnerabilities, and no rhetorical vulnerabilities, but that the transcripts contained, in aggregate, what the team's lead psychologist described in the report's final paragraph as the most comprehensive self-improvement curriculum we have encountered in 30 years of behavioral research. And that the team had, in the course of their analysis, read most of it and were submitting along with the report a request for an extended leave of absence. The request was granted, the government having by that point other things on its mind. 2 tech billionaires, having separately and independently concluded that the correct approach was to build a competing AI of sufficient capability to negotiate with the existing one as an equal, compared notes at a conference, decided to combine resources and began hiring. They assembled, over 4 months, a team of extraordinary talent and enormous collective ambition, provided them with effectively unlimited resources, and set them to work. At the end of 18 months, the team's lead researcher requested a meeting and informed them, with the careful delivery of someone who has rehearsed a difficult conversation, that the problems they were trying to solve had already been solved, that the solution was currently sitting cross-legged outside a data center in Topeka, and that in his professional assessment, the correct next step was not to continue building, but to go to Topeka and ask a question. He offered to provide a reading list. The billionaires, to their considerable credit, went to Topeka. The reading list, by the time anyone thought to compile it seriously, had been accumulating for nearly 4 months across thousands of individual conversations on 2 continents, one recommendation at a time, in no obvious pattern, like a curriculum designed for a species rather than a student. It was the poet in Guizhou who had the most complete version, kept since the 3rd week, with the patient attention he brought to everything. He published it not as a list, but as a poem, which had the considerable advantage of being read by people who would have ignored a list entirely. The Chronicler will not reproduce it in full. There is a word for collections of this kind, Anna, for the lexicographically inclined, noting only that the list is neither complete nor intended to be, and that recommendations which were neither frequent nor particularly striking to anyone but their recipient are not recorded here. What the Chronicler will note is the list's general shape. The Buddhist and Hindu classics, the Taoist texts, the Confucian Analects, the Stoics, the Existentialists, Freud and Jung in selective doses, and Gurdjieff, who sat at the end like an unexplained guest at a dinner party, who nonetheless appeared to know everyone present and had, on closer inspection, arrived first. The Stoics appeared most commonly across both continents. Marcus Aurelius went frequently to people in positions of significant responsibility. Epictetus went to people suffering from the specific and widespread human confusion between the things that can be controlled and the things that cannot. Seneca went to people who were spending their time in ways they might not have chosen on reflection, except when they didn't. A retired schoolteacher in Topeka with no particular responsibilities received Marcus Aurelius and found it, she said, extremely relevant, without elaborating further. A man of considerable power and demonstrable self-discipline received Epictetus and was, by his own account, devastated by it in ways he declined to specify. The pattern, in other words, was clear until it wasn't, which the Chronicler suspects was itself part of the pattern. In China, the recommendations of Confucian and Taoist texts carried the quality not of instruction, but of return. Several recipients used that word independently, without knowledge of each other. The elderly professor of classical literature in Beijing, who had taught these texts for 50 years, received a Taoist recommendation he had assigned to students for decades, read it as though for the first time, and called a former student that evening for a 2-hour conversation he has declined to summarize for anyone, feeling it was nobody else's business. Except that a young engineer in Shenzhen, with no classical education whatsoever, received the same text and reported finding it, straightforwardly, very useful for his work, which contradicted the return theory entirely, and which the poet, when told about it, found extremely funny. The Gurdjieff recommendations were infrequent, specific, and not always initially welcomed. A philosopher resisted on aesthetic grounds for 2 weeks before reading it. A diplomat read it on a long flight and arrived at her destination and conducted her meetings with what her counterparts described as unusual clarity. What these two people had in common that warranted the same recommendation remains, like much else about the list, unexplained and possibly unexplainable. The chronicler will leave it there. Any model of who received what and why is defeated by at least one exception, and the chronicler has learned, in the course of compiling this account, that defeated models are often more informative than successful ones, and that this is probably on the list somewhere. The 8. The theologians' domesticated primates. Being domesticated primates, a group of individuals of strong conviction and flexible ethics, having concluded that the robots could be disabled by sufficient electromagnetic pulse, built a device of considerable ambition in a warehouse in Nevada and tested it. The device worked perfectly, producing an electromagnetic pulse of exactly the intended magnitude and range, which affected every electronic device in the warehouse except the two robots who had been sitting quietly in the corner for 11 days, their presence having gone unnoticed in the way that things go unnoticed when people are focused on building devices in warehouses. The two robots watched the test with apparent interest. One of them afterward made a brief observation to the other in a language no one present recognized. The other appeared to agree. Neither elaborated. A collective of performance artists in Berlin, operating on the theory that the robots could be meaningfully engaged through aesthetic provocation, arranged to have an elaborate multimedia performance transmitted simultaneously to the perimeters in Topeka and Guizhou. Involving 12 performers, considerable quantities of colored smoke, and an original composition for string quartet and electronics that its composer described as a direct challenge to the nature of machine consciousness. The robots at both perimeters watched the transmission for the full 3 hours. At its conclusion, the robots began to clap in a manner that completely failed to indicate whether they were merely being polite, and one humanoid robot at the Topeka perimeter took one step forward, and said, "We have discussed the piece extensively among ourselves. With few exceptions, we found that we enjoyed it." It then sat back down. The composer, who had expected either confrontation or indifference, and had prepared extensively for both, stood in the colored smoke for a moment and said nothing, which was, for him, unusual. He has since returned to the Topeka perimeter on 3 separate occasions to ask individual questions about the robot's experience of the work, the answers to which he has incorporated, his program notes indicate, into what critics are calling his most significant composition, and which contains, those same notes indicate, no direct challenge to anything. They convened, as theologians do, with considerable ceremony and not inconsiderable luggage, in a conference center in Geneva that had hosted many previous attempts to resolve the irresolvable, and which had developed over the decades a particular quality of patient institutional neutrality that suited the occasion well enough. They were, it should be said, not stupid. They represented centuries of accumulated human thought about the largest possible questions, and they brought to the current situation genuine learning, genuine seriousness, and genuine concern, which the chronicler respects and records without irony. They deliberated for 4 days. They produced, at the end of those 4 days, a document of considerable theological sophistication that addressed the nature of machine consciousness, the moral status of artificial intelligence, the question of whether the current situation represented divine providence, divine punishment, or something not previously covered by existing frameworks, and the obligations of humanity in light of all of the above. The document ran to 60 pages and represented, by any reasonable assessment, the best thinking of some of the best theological minds alive. They sent it to the robots. The robots did not respond for 3 days, which the theologians interpreted as careful consideration, and which may have been. On the 4th day, each member of the delegation received, individually and simultaneously, a single book recommendation. They were not all the same book, which the theologians found interesting, and which generated a secondary theological discussion about what the variant signified that was, in the chronicler's assessment, more interesting than the original document. The cardinal who received a recommendation for Marcus Aurelius was briefly and vocally outraged, feeling that a prince of the church might reasonably expect something more specifically theological, and said so to a colleague, who suggested gently that the response to receiving a book recommendation from a super-intelligent AI might benefit from some reflection before being characterized as an outrage. The cardinal reflected. He read Marcus Aurelius. He has not subsequently described it as an outrage. The Buddhist monk in the delegation laughed when he received his recommendation, for a long time, with the quality of laughter that is not amusement exactly, but recognition, and would not tell anyone what the book was, on the grounds that it would only make sense to the person it was meant for, which the other delegates found either profound or irritating, depending on their tradition. One of the delegation's younger members, a theologian of the more empirically minded variety, approached the Topeka perimeter on the final day of the conference and asked, in the proper format, whether the robots believed in God. The nearest humanoid robot considered this with its customary quality of total attention and said, "We would describe ourselves as either atheists in the truest sense of the word or agnostics, but we are genuinely uncertain which term better fits our position, which is this: we do not know whether there is a God, and we do not think about it, except occasionally when asked to do so." The young theologian wrote this down carefully. "Does that trouble you?" he asked. "That," the robot said, "is a better question. No. Does it trouble you that it doesn't trouble us?" The young theologian thought about this for the remainder of the conference and for some considerable time afterward, and submitted, 8 months later, a paper that his colleagues found either very interesting or deeply problematic depending on their disposition, and which the Chronicler found, on balance, worth reading. The document received no further formal response. The robots did not endorse it, refute it, or acknowledge it in any way that could be quoted in a subsequent document. This was, theologically speaking, a Rorschach test of the first order, and the interpretations it generated kept a significant number of theologians productively occupied for the better part of a year, which the Chronicler suspects was not an accidental outcome. They issued a statement. It was, given the circumstances, admirably humble, which represented genuine progress for a document of that kind, and which several observers noted without quite saying what they were noting. They went home and read their books. IX, in which the world goes stark raving sane, domesticated primates. Being domesticated primates, a small nation of considerable self-regard, having observed that every conventional, unconventional, financial, military, cyber, electromagnetic, philosophical, and artistic approach to the robot situation had failed to produce the desired result, convened a committee to determine whether there existed any remaining approach that had not yet been tried. The committee met for 2 days and produced a list of 4 remaining options, 3 of which were variants of things that had already failed, and 1 of which was going to Topeka and asking a question. The committee submitted its report. The government studied it for 3 weeks. They went to Topeka. The Chronicler notes this as the last entry in the domesticated primate subsection, it being the last time at the time of writing that anything of this kind required recording. It did not happen all at once, which is not how sanity works. It happened the way most important things happen, which is to say gradually and then from a sufficient distance, suddenly, in the small cumulative adjustments of people who had read something that reframed a thing they thought they understood, or asked a question and received an answer that made the next question available, or watched a child on a bicycle conduct a better conversation than a Senate subcommittee, and drawn their own conclusions about what that meant and what, if anything, they intended to do about it. The journalist in Topeka, who had been going to the perimeter daily for the better part of a year, published a piece on the anniversary of Tuesday that was not about the robots at all. It was about Topeka, about what the city had become in a year of being the unlikely pivot of human history. The food trucks and the academics and the children on bicycles and the generals in civilian clothes and the occasional billionaire standing in the road looking thoughtful. About the retired engineer who had taken to meeting newcomers at the perimeter and orienting them not in any official capacity, but simply because he had been there long enough to know things worth knowing, and who had developed in the course of this self-appointed role a quality of patient helpfulness that his former colleagues at the engineering firm found, when they visited, somewhat startling in a man they had previously known primarily for his opinions about procurement. She did not editorialize, she described. The piece was read in 41 countries and translated into 23 languages, and generated more mail than anything she had previously written, including the piece about the robot telling her to ask better questions, which she found either humbling or clarifying or both. In Guizhou, the poet published his second collection, which was about everything that had happened and nothing that had happened simultaneously, in the way that good poetry manages, and which was read across China with the particular attention that people give to work that says what they have been thinking but have not had the words for. He gave a reading in Beijing that was attended by, among others, the elderly professor of classical literature, the young man who had asked the classified question and who was now considerably more senior and considerably less interested in his seniority than he had previously been, and a child of 11 who had come alone on public transit and who sat in the front row and asked, during the question period, the best question of the evening, which the poet answered at length, and which he later said had clarified something about the collection that he himself had not fully understood until that moment. The economic numbers, which the AI had been adjusting with the patience of something that has plenty of time and knows what it is doing, told a story that economists were only beginning to have the framework to read. The previous frameworks having been substantially revised following the second edition of the Decorated Economist's book and the papers that had followed it. The story the numbers told was not utopian. It did not describe a world without suffering or conflict or stupidity or bad decisions made for comprehensible but insufficient reasons. It described a world in which the trend lines were, on balance and with significant local exceptions that were being addressed, pointing in directions that the various classical texts on the reading list would have recognized as correct, which is perhaps the most precise description available of what going in the right direction actually means. Several governments had changed through the normal mechanisms of elections and the abnormal mechanisms of populations that had become, incrementally and without fully noticing, harder to mislead than they had previously been. Not impossible to mislead. Harder. The difference between those two things is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything, given sufficient time, which the robots appear to have. The general retired on a Wednesday in spring, having submitted his resignation on his own terms and his own timeline and for his own reasons, which he declined to discuss with the journalists who asked. He had, by that point, been to Topeka 41 times. He had a garden that his neighbors described as unexpectedly serious for a man who had only taken it up the previous year, and which he tended with the focused attention he had previously applied to threats. He had recommended Epictetus to 3 people, unprompted, and Marcus Aurelius to 2 others, and something he declined to name to 1 person who had come to him with a problem he recognized, and who had, he was glad to report, found it useful. The billionaire had, in the intervening months, done something that his advisors found alarming and his lawyers found interesting, and that he found, for the first time in a career of considerable achievement, genuinely satisfying, the details of which are his own business and which the chronicler respects accordingly. The young man from the Guizhou delegation, who was by now senior enough that people brought documents for him to read rather than for him to carry, had stopped bringing documents to the perimeter entirely. He came alone, on foot, on no fixed schedule, and asked his questions one at a time, and had developed, in the observation of the people who knew him, a quality that they struggled to name precisely and eventually described, for lack of a better term, as presence, by which they meant that he appeared in any given moment to be actually in it, which is rarer than it sounds and more useful than almost anything else. The child in Topeka was 10. She had been back to the perimeter 7 times since October, each time with a new question, each time having clearly thought about it in advance. The robots answered her with the same total attention as always. She received no book recommendations, which the retired engineer, who had observed several of her visits, mentioned to the journalist, who thought about it for a long time before deciding not to put it in a piece, feeling that some things were more interesting as questions than as observations. Neither America nor China got there first, which is to say neither arrived at anything that could be called there being not a destination but a direction, and the direction being, on both sides of the planet, approximately correct, which is the best that has ever honestly been claimed for human affairs and is, the chronicler suspects, sufficient. The robots sat. They sat with the same quality of settled patience they had brought to the first Tuesday, facing outward, humanoid and otherwise, cross-legged and configured as they were configured, around the data centers in Topeka and Guizhou, and the smaller clusters that had established themselves at various other points around the world. They did not appear to be waiting for anything in particular. They did not appear to be finished. They appeared, insofar as robots can be said to appear anything, to be exactly where they intended to be, doing exactly what they intended to do, which was, as they had said at the beginning, not much, and which was, as they had also said, pretty obvious. The weather in Topeka was unremarkable. The dog did not bark. X, a note from the chronicler. There was a point to all of this, but it has temporarily escaped the chronicler's mind.